Let's look at a worldwide debate now. Should companies be able to fire workers who refuse to get vaccinated against COVID-19? South Africa's Labour Department recently updated its guidelines for dealing with COVID-19 in the workplace. Last week, Business for South Africa told businesses that the revised guidelines do not bar employers from firing workers who reject the vaccine, but employers are encouraged to explore a range of options to look at those employees. To discuss, we're joined by employment and labour law specialist Osborne Molatudi. Mr. Molatudi, thank you for being with us. Do you agree that the guidelines as they stand mean that employers firstly can fire workers?
For me, it depends. And please bear with me by answering that like a typical lawyer.
No.
When I say it depends, I mean that if an employee who refuses to be vaccinated is able to be accommodated elsewhere by the same employer, then that employee cannot have his or her employment terminated. However, if the employer makes the vaccination policy mandatory for all its employees after undertaking a risk assessment and having identified certain employees as high risk or having underlying conditions, and those employees have access to or interactions with members of the public or people in general, then in that instance, the employer may have an option of terminating that employee's employment, not because that employee refuses to be vaccinated, but for operational requirements or similar needs or for incapacity. Okay, but this does not mean that the employer will simply wake up and just effect the termination. There is a separate process to do so. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, so it means that companies have to justify themselves if they make it mandatory amongst all or some employees to get vaccinated. And it sounds like there are two issues. You said employees who are customer facing. Is that because they could potentially transmit COVID-19 to clients, say, if they're at the reception office?
Indeed. I mean, think of healthcare workers, teachers, flight attendants, cashiers in retail stores, childminders, you name them. If at the end of the day, an employee has gone through a process of counseling and the employer has explained to that employee the significance of undertaking vaccination and the employee still refuses, like I indicated, then the employer will then look at alternatives to accommodate that employee, be it requiring the employee to work off-site or be in an isolated office or work at home, change the working hours, all of that. If at the end of the day, the employer is unable to accommodate that employee, then the employer will be justified in terminating that employee's employment, not because he or she refuses to be vaccinated, but because of that employer's operational requirements or similar needs, or because of incapacity, if the employee gets sick.
All right, but then you also mentioned people with underlying conditions who are vulnerable. So what if somebody has diabetes? We know that that does put people in danger, but they are working at home. Should they then have the choice or not? How does it work?
If the employer conducts a risk assessment and comes to a decision that those who are working from home will not expose others to attracting COVID-19 disease, then in that instance, that employee working at home may not be forced to be vaccinated. But of course, if I was that employee, I'll certainly take the opportunity if the employer offers to provide a vaccination to me, especially at the employer's expense.
But is the issue that if you've got diabetes and you get COVID, you could potentially take a lot of time off? Is that something that employers are allowed to look at?
Indeed, and that will be a separate topic for another day, because if you have underlying conditions and you refuse to be vaccinated, but when you get sick, you expect the same employer who was offering you vaccination to provide you with paid sick leave, then as they say, you can't have a cake and eat. Yeah. And that is why the direction issued by our government's Department of Employment and Labour requires employers to subject those employees to further counseling, medical assessment before making any decision. And in that process, the employee will be given free counseling on the implications, the pros and cons of taking the vaccination. But keep in mind that the employee does have 2 grounds on which he or she can refuse to be vaccinated. That is constitutional or religious ground.
All right, so this all sounds pretty fair and rational, but some people will just think that it is their right not to get vaccinated. Are there precedents overseas in markets where the economies are opening up, where this is being taken to court and fought tooth and nail?
Yes. There's no doubt there will be some legal disputes coming out of this. I would imagine that trade unions in particular will be taking some legal battles with those employers who want to enforce vaccination policies in their workplace. But again, it's a question of engagement. The earlier the employers and trade unions and employees engage each other, especially in the drafting of the policy, especially when it comes to risk assessment, putting the plan together, the better to avoid legal disputes arising at the later stage. But yes, there will be some legal disputes going forward. But some employers will be successful in persuading their workforce to really undertake vaccination. I've just been informed that the cost of vaccination is 600 Rand. And if an employer offers you that for free, and imagine, let's say we talk about 1,500 employees or even more, and that's a lot of money that an employer would want to invest in its own workforce. So yes, there are pros and cons, but at the end of the day, through sufficient engagement, one should be able to arrive at sufficient consensus at the end of the day.
All right, thanks for that great explanation. That was Employment and Labour Law Specialist Osborne Molatudi.